Welcome to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. There are no traffic jams along the Extra Mile when you're studying for your bar exam. And now, your host, Jackson Mummy, owner of the Celebration Bar Review.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to episode 283 of the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers. This is your host, Jackson Mummy. Really glad to have you with us in this middle of December. And boy, time is just going by so fast. It feels like to me, I don't know if anybody else feels like we got a real rush between Thanksgiving and Christmas. And it really seems to have affected the bar study process as well. People are very focused and dedicated in December this year. I think that's a good thing, but it seems a little weird. Usually there's a little bit of downtime as people sort of catch their breath from one holiday before they jump into the next. This year, it just doesn't seem that way at all. Well, in the midst of all this holiday busyness, I'm so glad that you found us. If this is your first time in the podcast, we are really glad to have you here. We provide these episodes in both video and audio format. I'll just let you know that if you'd like to watch the video version, you can do that by going to celebrationbarreview.com/283. That's the episode number. If you prefer to listen to the podcast, that's great. You can do that on Apple Podcasts or on iHeartRadio or in radio.com or Spotify and lots of other places where podcasts are syndicated. And you can also find our entire archive of library. We've done this for years now. It's on our website. Just check out under the blogs. You'll see a link to podcast episodes. And so you can check all of those out as well. Now, in today's episode, we're going to begin a three-part series that I am very excited about. As many of you know, we recently conducted our twice-a-year live boot camp for bar exam takers here in Celebration. And as part of that boot camp experience, we talked about something called the three voices of failure. This is the way that the brain works to sabotage us and how you can manage that, deal with it, eliminate it in many cases, and keep moving forward towards your goal of passing the bar exam. Over the next three episodes, I'm going to break that discussion down into three distinct discussions. We're going to talk about the three guardians or gateways that keep us from moving positively towards the changes that we want in life. And this is true for anything, but certainly for the bar exam, it applies. And so in today's episode, we're going to look at the first of those voices, what we call the voice of fear. And we're going to talk about how the voice of fear manifests itself, what practices you can take to eliminate or reduce it in your life and in your bar studies, and some tools that will be helpful to you as well to manage that voice. In upcoming episodes, we're going to look at the voice of cynicism and the voice of judgment. So I hope you'll stick around over the next couple of weeks to check out this series. I'm really, really excited about it. I think that the reaction we had from our boot camp participants was very positive. Many of them remarked about how helpful it was to them to begin to understand what's going on in their own minds and frankly, just our emotional attachment and reaction to the bar exam is such a big part of what happens. Now, if you're a bar repeater, you absolutely should not miss these episodes because they're going to speak directly, I think, to some of the concerns you have. Something else I want to suggest to you, particularly if you're repeating the bar exam, is to join us for our free online training. It's called Do Something Different, Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam. Now, this training is something we've offered for years, and now we've advanced to the point where it's available on demand. All you have to do is click on the button here on the show notes, whether you're in the audio or the video version of the podcast today, and you can select the day and time for the training that best suits your schedule. Don't miss out on this training, however, because it is vitally important. It's a look at how successful bar takers found a way to do something different and go from failing to passing the exam. You'll hear from them in their own words. We'll show you step-by-step what it takes to be successful on the exam. It could be the most valuable 90 minutes you spend in preparation for the bar in your entire process and journey. And it's completely free. So I want to make sure that you check that out. Now, if you want more details about the training, you can go to our URL, our website at celebrationbarreview.com/webinar. Or as I said, if you just want to jump right in and schedule the opportunity and you can watch it right away, just head over to the show notes and click on the link there. And by the way, if you are watching the webinar on demand and you have a question, you'll see that there's an opportunity right there to shoot off a question or a comment. It'll go directly to me and I will respond back to you. So I really hope that you'll take a few minutes and watch this training, participate in the different pieces of information that we offer there. It is life-changing information, and I hope that you'll check that out. So do something different, make the next bar exam your last bar exam. And if you're a little bit afraid about doing that, well, then I think you're in the right place today, because we're going to talk about the first of these three guardians of the gateway of change. And the first guardian is this voice of fear. It's a big one, it's a scary one, and it's deeply rooted in our brains. So I don't want to keep you waiting any longer. Let's jump into today's message. Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to the first in a three-part series called The Three Voices of Failure. I know that's not a very uplifting title, but the reality is that there are three voices we hear inside of all of our heads pretty much all of the time. And when it comes to a high-stakes event like the bar exam, hearing those three voices of failure is the surest way to not being successful on the exam. And so in these next three videos, I want to talk about each of those three voices, what they are, how to be aware of them, what to do about them, most importantly, so that you can banish them from being the preeminent voice in your brain. Now, the background behind me is a neural network. It's a pathway laid out, and we have lots of neural networks in our brains. But I think the best way to understand these three voices of failure is to begin with an understanding of what the brain's different areas of responsibility are. Put very simply, there are three specific areas of the brain that all coordinate and work together. The oldest part of the human brain is called the reptilian brain, and this is the part of our brain that's designed to keep us safe. And in that safety, we are constantly looking for danger, for the things that might destroy us or kill us or hurt us in some way. And associated with this oldest part of the brain is a voice called the voice of fear. In today's message, we're going to take a deeper look at that voice of fear. But that's the oldest voice we have, and it's one of the most loud voices for many people. And it comes from our reptilian brain. Now, if you imagine the reptilian brain is overwrapped or laid on top of by a second, somewhat less old or newer brain that we call the mammalian brain. The mammalian brain developed after our reptilian brain in order to begin to develop a greater sense of the ego and the id. And with the mammalian brain, we are looking at this sense of being loved or accepted. And the voice that the mammalian brain has is the voice of cynicism. It's the voice that says, I'm not loved, I'm not accepted enough. And it's different than being fearful. It's literally being drawn into the world and society and connecting and feeling like you're one of the cool kids, if you will, instead of one of the outsiders. For bar takers, this voice is particularly prevalent. And we're going to take a look in the second video specifically at that voice of cynicism. Now, going from the reptilian brain to the mammalian brain, on top of those two, we have the new brain, or the neocortex. And the neocortex actually has two components to it. It has the left brain and the right brain, what we think of as the analytical, logical, and the creative side of the brain. Now, this neocortex, though, in addition to having the more modern sense of who we are as individuals, also contains a voice of failure. And this voice is called the voice of judgment. The voice of judgment very simply says, I am not enough. And for bar takers, I'm not sure that there's any voice that's louder than the voice that says, I am not enough. You're being measured, you're being evaluated, you're being assessed on whether or not you are enough to practice law. And so in our third video, we'll take a specific look at this voice of judgment and how you can identify it, and most importantly, what you can do to silence it or at least put it in its place. Now, interestingly enough, we need all three parts of our brain. We need the reptilian brain, including the voice of fear, to keep us safe. We need the mammalian brain, including the voice of cynicism, to keep us connected to the world. And we need the neocortex and the voice of judgment to give us the sense of identity, of being self-sufficient. Without all three of these parts of the brain working together, we're going to have psychopathic behavior. And frankly, I've seen some psychopathic bar takers over my years of teaching, and it's not a pretty sight. And I don't want any of you to be in that circumstance. So what we want to do over these next 3 videos is to take a deeper dive on each of these 3 voices. I want you to understand what they are, how they operate in your life as a bar taker specifically, and what tools and approaches you can use to be able to control those and make them productive voices instead of destructive voices. Let's begin with that first voice. As I said, it's the reptilian brain, and it is called the voice of fear. It's the oldest part of our brain because as humans were developing, survival of the species was obviously the first and most important directive that existed. The reptilian brain tells us when we should be afraid. And the voice that we hear, one of the 3 guardians of change for most people, is the voice that says, I am not safe enough. Now, I mentioned this idea of guardians of change or guardians of the gate. When you're trying to change, when you're trying to do something new or exciting or something that stretches you or challenges you, there is an internal part of each of these 3 brains that steps in and says, well, wait a minute, I'm not sure that's a great idea. Let's make sure we've got this worked out before we venture into this new territory. And the reptilian brain is the one that just screams out for safety. I like to think of the reptilian brain as sort of like being the lizard that on a nice sunny day comes out of the water. Here in Celebration, we have lots of waters and lakes, and in Florida, we have lots of gators. And the gators like to come out on sunny days and just lie on the ground. And they're kind of basking in the sun, and they're calm and happy, and everything's cool. Now, if something startles them, suddenly they just move super fast to protect themselves, and they huddle in. If the idea of an alligator jumping back into the water is not something that makes you feel very good, think of a turtle sticking its head inside a shell. When there is fear, the reptilian brain kicks into action and it says, don't do this. Danger, Will Robinson, don't move into that new territory. Don't do that. Well, what does that mean for a bar taker? Well, very few things are as fraught with fear as taking a high-stakes exam that will influence or affect the outcome of your professional life for perhaps the rest of your life. Because people have heard so much about the bar exam, and certainly in the current environment, there is plenty of negative messaging out there about how difficult the exam is, how hard it is, how few people pass the exam. And so the level of fear has gone up, I think, proportionately over the years that I've been teaching. When I took the bar exam, most people expected to pass. That was the norm. Today, in taking the bar exam, the norm is that most people will not pass on their first try. In fact, most people will need up to 4 attempts to get through the exam, and many, many more will have to go on far beyond 4 attempts. When you become aware of those numbers and statistics, or you just hear the anecdotes and stories, it's enough to create fear in most of us. And we start to think, oh my God, what if that's me? Now, sometimes this is laughable. I have heard this fear come from top of the class law students graduating 3Ls at top law schools in the country. Now, we know statistically that that group is going to pass. They're the ones that will absolutely pass, and yet their fear is no less than the bottom of the class person at a lower tiered law school, perhaps someone who's taken the exam previously and not been successful. They both exhibit the same level of fear. And I think it's important to understand this, that no matter what you think in terms of the fear that you're responding to with the bar exam, it's basically the same for everyone in the room. If you've actually been in the bar and taken the exam and you think back to that experience, think about the other people in the room. The anxiety, the stress, the tension that you could feel in the room was palpable. And it's because fear was the overwhelming emotion, I think, that goes through those rooms. And fear is, I think it is a virus that you can catch. Someone's afraid and they're around you, they're going to make you afraid as well. And when we have fear, the voice from our reptilian brain says, I am not safe enough. And that can cause us to freeze up. It can cause you in the bar exam to suddenly forget what you know, or to forget the way that you learned to write. It can cause you to make mistakes with timing, or to bubble your Scantron sheet incorrectly. Fear can cause you to do stupid things like bring your luggage to the test site on the second day when you can't bring it into the room, and so you're kicked out of the exam. Fear can cause you to not set up your computer properly or to not read the instructions about how to use your computer on the bar exam. Fear has so many ways that it pokes its head up and causes us to have problems. And as a result, we have a lot of students who never get past that reptilian level of fear. These are students who are finding themselves unable to sleep before the exam, or can't eat food and keep it down, or start to engage in self-destructive behaviors with drinking or alcohol or drugs. These are all signs of fear, and that fear can be literally overwhelming to people. I hear from bar students who are 6 months to a year away from their exam, and they're already afraid. That is a very difficult thing to sustain over a long period of time. So I don't think it's overstating it to say that this voice of fear that says I'm not safe enough is in fact a voice of failure. And if you let it control you, there is nothing good that happens from that. I have never heard anyone who says that fearful adrenaline causes students to do better on the exam. I see no evidence of that in my own practice, and I would suggest to you that anyone that tells you that you should be afraid and therefore you will do better is just kidding you, and it's simply not true. Well, having identified what that fear looks like, and I'm sure I could stop for a moment and let you think about how that fear has manifested itself in your own life, maybe not on the bar exam, but on other things that you've done up to this point. I think it's also then equally important, if not more so, to talk about what the practices are that remove or reduce the sound of that voice of fear. And there are three practices in brain research that we are relatively convinced today really do mitigate that voice of fear. The first practice is the practice of awareness. What we mean by awareness is to separate fact from fiction. You know, one of the interesting things about the brain is that we do not act against our own self-interest unless you're a sociopath. Now, assuming that none of you are sociopaths, the reality is that you will act in your own best interest all the time. The problem, however, is that if you feed information into your brain that tells you it would be in your best interest to not go to the exam, or to blow up in the exam so that you're not really being evaluated, or to presume that there's something happening in the exam that in reality isn't, that lack of awareness can cause you to self-destruct. One of the realities of awareness is that when we are aware of what we're doing, of the choices we're making, we tend to make much better choices. It's only when we're not aware that we tend to make self-destructive choices. That is, in life, if you think back to some of the worst decisions you've made, most of the time those decisions were made without much awareness of what you were doing. You just acted in the moment, or you acted impulsively, or you acted again out of fear, or you acted on bad information. Awareness is key to reducing the voice of fear, because awareness makes us understand that it's not really something of danger. Now, for the reptilian brain, that means that when you see a stick on the sidewalk, that while your reptilian brain suddenly jumps up and screams, "Yikes, snake, get out of the way," the rest of your body looks down, looks and says, "Oh, that's just a stick." And in your awareness of that moment, the voice of fear is quieted. Now, on the bar exam, the voice of fear raises its head and says, "Oh my God, it's terrible, no one passes." Well, awareness tells us that that's not true. People do pass the bar exam, and the people who pass the bar exam have a specific methodology and approach that they use. If you dedicate yourself to doing the work and putting in the time and the effort, and you follow a proven plan, you can be successful on the exam. And so the mythology that no one passes is just that, and you need to be careful about that. But there are other kinds of fiction that you should be aware of as well. There's the fiction that says that you can pass the bar by outsmarting it. You can pass the bar by working harder than the examiners. You can pass the bar by memorizing and cramming. You can pass the bar by reciting elements. You can pass the bar by spotting issues. All of those are fictions. They're empirically proven to not be true. For most people that follow that approach, don't pass the bar on their first try. In fact, if they haven't passed on their first try and they employ those approaches, it's almost certain that they won't pass, and the pass rates prove that. So what you can do is to research what works. And what works is consistently demonstrating your ability to apply patterns in the law and knowledge of the law, not memorization of the law, both to your writing, to your performance tests if they're on your exam, and to the multi-state exam. When you know those techniques, when you've learned how to write in a way that's different than what you did in law school, when you've learned how to address multiple choice questions by identifying the patterns and predicting answers instead of trying to do fine line distinctions between answer choices, suddenly you have more information, and information is power. It is awareness. And in that awareness, you now have data that you can use, and the data quiets the voice of fear that says you're not safe enough. So the practice of awareness becomes critically important to being successful on the exam, because the more you know, the less afraid you will be about the test. The second practice that's so important for reducing the voice of fear is the practice of trust. You know, bar takers are notable for their lack of trust. You've come through a law school system, most of you, in which it was hard to know who to trust. Do you trust your professors? Do you trust your classmates? Do you trust what people are telling you about the test, about school, about the world of law? And if you're anything like me, you found that there were some trustworthy people, but there were a lot of people that were not trustworthy at all. And I'm afraid that in our profession today, we're probably ranked right alongside used car salesmen and TSA security agents for likable people. The reality of trust is that it's low. There's a low trust factor in our society, I think, at large today. And there's a low trust factor certainly in the practice of law and the legal education world. And I would go so far as to say there's a lack of trust in the bar review industry. Now, part of the reason I think there's a lack of trust in bar review is that for the better part of the last 35 or 40 years, there have been a group of bar review providers who have cynically gone ahead and assumed that it didn't really matter what they did because most people would pass for many years. And now, even though most people don't pass, it doesn't really matter because people don't recognize that they have any choices. And so they simply tell those bar takers what they want to hear. Then when it turns out that's not true and trust is broken, then the bar review shrugs their shoulders and says, yeah, well, next, there's a new class coming, you go on and leave us alone. And that lack of trust becomes really endemic to the way that people can then prepare going forward. I spend a good deal of my time talking to people who failed the bar exam and come to me on their second, third, fourth, or how many ever tries. And one of the things that I consistently have to deal with is the broken bond of trust that they have between themselves as a student and their mentor or the bar review provider that they went to initially. That's really a sad commentary on our profession. I think that the reality for most bar takers is that they don't know who to trust or what to trust. There's some things that I think you should not trust. You should not trust what you read in the media about the bar exam. It's generally not very accurate. And we talk about that in our podcast episodes all the time. The statistics are often skewed, they're often not fully explained, and they can send you in the wrong direction. I don't think you should necessarily trust your law school when it comes to the bar exam either. Some law schools clearly have a reputation at stake or even their viability at stake by bar passage rates. And so they manipulate and play games with their numbers and statistics. They set up classes that you're required to take instead of being able to take real law classes. They do all sorts of things that I think diminish or reduce the trust that their students would have in them. And they have the added problem that most of the people on a law school faculty know absolutely nothing about the bar exam. Many of them never even took the bar, and they're academics. And they're great academics, but they're not bar taker professionals. And the result of that is that law schools give out a lot of incorrect or at least not very accurate information. And so trust is diminished there as well. You should absolutely not trust your cohorts, the people that tell you what they did on the bar. I am surprised how often people come to find out that the friend that told them about exactly what they did and what a great score they got might have been not telling them the truth. There is a lot of misinformation out there, and a lot of it is spread voice to voice, person to person. Look, your bar results are personal, and it's tough to talk about them in public. one of the things that I'm so appreciative of is that we have students that do interviews with us after they're successful, and they are very transparent about their results. That is a hard thing to do. And I would be very skeptical of people that aren't willing to be that transparent about what happened and what they did. And so trust is broken down that way as well. So how do you regain that trust? Well, I think one of the things that you do is that you look for a bar review and a mentor who will be truthful with you, who will not tell you that you can pass the bar exam if you don't study, or if you can cram and do it all in just a few days or hours or weeks, or who tells you that they have a 90% pass rate. No one has that kind of pass rate. You should not trust companies that have not been around very long. You shouldn't trust companies that don't have a good reputation. You shouldn't trust mentors who don't have experience teaching. I think those things all make sense. They're all common sense. But you should look for a mentor, a coach, a company that you feel represents the approach that you want to the exam, and then put your trust in them. Trust that they are telling you what you need to know. Ask the hard questions. Ask the questions about the approach and the methodology and the reasons and the background. Ask what the bar review has done, what their track record is. Ask to hear from people who've been successful using their approach. If you find those things, then I think you can put your trust in them. But most importantly, once you've selected a bar review, a course, a provider, an approach, then put your trust in it. Now look, I wish everybody would choose Celebration Bar Review, but I know that that won't happen. And if you chose one of our competitors, okay, that's fine, but put your trust in them. Try it, give it a full effort. And then if it doesn't work, come back and talk to us. Now, I think you could save some effort by just coming to us in the first place. But truthfully, if you don't trust what you're hearing, you're in the wrong place. And you have to trust it in order to stop the voice of fear that says you're not safe enough. Because often what happens, and this is an amazing phenomenon, I can tell you within almost to a day when the big box bar review courses start their live programs. And the reason I can tell you is that typically within 48 hours of that moment, I start hearing from people who realize they've made a horrible mistake. They're in the wrong course, it doesn't work, and they don't trust it. If you're 48 hours into a big box bar review course and you don't trust it, get out. Get out right away. The voice of fear should be screaming at that point, you're not safe enough and you need to make a change. The worst thing you can do is sit there when you don't trust your provider and think that it's going to get better. The reality is it won't. And I've had students that have said, I don't trust your course. Well, that's a decision they have to make. And I recognize and respect that decision. And so I think that you should be very much aware of what your trust is and where your trust is, and trust that. The last thing I'd say about trust is you need to trust yourself. You need to trust that you were smart enough to get into law school. You were smart enough to graduate from law school. You're smart enough to be in a position to take the bar exam, whether this is your first time or your 25th time. It doesn't matter. You are smart enough. You are talented enough. You are capable enough. You must have trust in yourself. If you don't trust yourself, and we'll talk about this more in the other two discussions about the voice of cynicism and the voice of judgment. But if you don't trust yourself, then the voice of fear is going to rise up. And the voice of fear will tell you that you are not safe enough, and it will self-destruct and torpedo your efforts. And then the last practice to deal with the voice of fear is the practice of surrender. And surrender in this case doesn't mean waving the white flag and saying, I give up. That's not at all what we're talking about here. Surrender in that case would be saying, I guess I'm going to be this bear's lunch today. That is not what we're trying to do here. Surrender in this case means identifying reality and separating it from fantasy. You need to surrender surrender the fantasies that you've been holding. Perhaps you had a fantasy that you could study for the bar successfully by just putting in a couple of hours of study over a 6 or 7 week period of time. Surrender that fantasy, give it up. Be aware of the reality that it takes 250 to 300 hours of study time. Perhaps you had the fantasy that you could take care of the kids, have a full-time demanding job, take care of your community obligations, and study for the bar in a period of just a month or two. That's a fantasy. It won't happen in most cases. And so you need to surrender that fantasy. You don't have to be perfect. You don't have to be all things to all people. Give up those fantasies. Perhaps you had a fantasy that the bar examiners are going to take an elaborate and enormous amount of time reading all of your written work, that they will stroke their chins and smoke their pipes and think to themselves, what brilliant legal writing I'm reading. That's a fantasy. Your essays are being graded in most states by what I call Uber graders. These are people on a gig economy who are paid about $3.25 a test booklet to grade answers. They give you about 5 minutes of their time, and they are clearly not interested in thinking about the complexities and intricacies of your answer. They're simply using a draft or point sheet and marking it off. And so you need to surrender that fantasy and write appropriately to the audience that you're talking to. You see, there are all of these different fantasies that we build up in our minds about what's happening on the bar exam. Some of you have a fantasy that the bar examiners are out to get you personally. I hate to burst your bubble. They don't know who you are and they actually don't care. And even though their rules and requirements might seem absurd and in some cases onerous or punitive, they really don't care who you are or what you are. It matters not in the least to them. And when you build that up, it becomes bigger and bigger, and the voice of fear becomes louder and louder. The examiners really don't have any particular interest in you in any jurisdiction. Even in states like Florida that really go out of their way to make the entire exam experience as stressful as possible, actually don't care anything about what you're feeling or thinking about it. They just do it because it's their administrative process. And I think it's important to separate the reality of what's happening from the fantasy that you could build up. Because the bigger you make that fantasy, the more that you picture the bar examiner sitting around a table saying, oh, now we're considering John Smith's application, and this one, oh, we hate John. That doesn't happen. It's not there. And so when you build up that fantasy, you build up the voice of fear. If you are taking it from a realistic perspective, you recognize that it's blind grading, you're given a number, your essays are being graded, a machine is grading your multi-state bar exam, and none of that really matters. And even when the proctors are being a little ridiculous or a lot ridiculous during the test day, it really has nothing to do with you specifically. And so you need to surrender those fantasies that have been holding on and that you've been holding on to, because even though they may be miserable fantasies, they are comfortable fantasies, and they encourage the voice of fear to say, we're not safe. I'm not safe enough. So let go of them. Now, you probably noticed that in all three of these practices, we're talking about having a greater sense of self-awareness and of reality versus fantasy or fiction. And we've got a couple of tools that I think can make a big difference here. And I want to wrap up this message by talking about a couple of those tools. One of the most effective tools I've found for dealing with the voice of fear is the concept of meditation. Now, meditation obviously is a practice used by lots of people in lots of places. Over the past 25 or so years, I have been using a specific form of meditation developed by a company called Centerpoint Research Institute. They developed many years ago a product called Holosync Audio Meditation. And one of the reasons I liked Holosync so much was that it required very little of me as a participant. That is, I just put on a set of headphones or earbuds, and I listened to soothing water chime background sounds, and the soundtrack actually meditated my brain. The way it did this was by setting different levels of sound wave frequencies in the left brain and in the right brain. And the brain, in its attempt to equalize those different sound frequencies, creates new neural pathways. Well, what Bill Harris, the founder of Centerpoint, discovered a long time ago was that in the process of creating those new neural pathways, we mimicked the process of what traditional meditation had been about. So instead of having to chant or focus solely on my breathing or sit still for a long period of time, although all of those are great practices and very useful, the idea of an audio meditation was that it did the meditating for me. It would do that work if I was sleeping or awake. It would do it if I were at the gym walking, or I was out somewhere doing something, almost anything except operating a car or heavy machinery. But it was an extremely effective way to gain that clarity. Now, I had the good pleasure of being a an acquaintance and a student of Bill's. And prior to his death a couple of years ago, we did a couple of discussions and interviews, and we've linked to those in other places, and we'll link to them again here. But in my last conversation with Bill, we talked about this idea of awareness. And I called it mindfulness. And he said, no, not really. It's really about awareness. It's knowing what you are doing. It's being aware of your circumstance and what you're doing that might be getting in your own way. His position, and I think he was right, was that when we're aware, we don't do things deliberately to hurt ourselves. Again, it's what we do unconsciously, non-consciously, that causes problems and pain for us. And so his view was that meditation could be a huge step towards awareness. I would go so far as to say it also helps in terms of just understanding who we are and recognizing the voice of fear when we hear it. Now, we offer the Holosync audio meditation as part of our course, and we'll link to that as well. We think it can be a very powerful tool. 30 minutes to 60 minutes a day. You can listen to it at night. You can listen to it while you sleep. You can listen to it any place that you want. And I've been doing this meditation for years and years and years. I think it makes all the difference in the world. I wouldn't go a day without it. And so I really encourage that. Now, if you don't want to use the Holosync system, there are plenty of other meditation systems out there. Another great one is done by a company called Muse, M-U-S-E. And Muse has this wonderful headband that you put across your forehead. And as you're focusing on your breathing, it gives you biofeedback. When you're not focused, you hear waves and crashing thunder and storm sounds. And when you're calm and relaxed and aware, you hear birds chirping, and you get very fixated on wanting to hear more birds. It's a great system, and we'll link to that as well. In any event, there are lots of ways that you can use meditation, but we think it's a powerful tool for bar takers because it improves your awareness. It reduces the voice of fear saying, I am not safe enough. A second tool I want to make you aware of is something called a paraliminal recording. Now, paraliminal recordings take the same approach, in fact, as the audio meditation, and they use the same background soundtracks developed by Bill Harris and Centerpoint as part of their technology. Paraliminals are literally two separate voice tracks going to the left and right brain that you listen to with headphones or earbuds again. And they are built around specific topics and specific blocks that we might have in our life. And they're wonderful. They last about 20 to 30 minutes. And what happens is that as your brain is setting up these new neural pathways, the two voices that you're hearing in your head simultaneously cause your conscious brain to sort of check out, if you will, and you're now talking to the non-conscious brain. Well, we developed a set of 16 paraliminal recordings curated for bar exam takers specifically, working with the people at Learning Strategies who created the paraliminal sets and work with us on photo reading for the bar exam. Now, within this group of paraliminal recordings, there are recordings on anxiety-free, which is great for I am not safe enough. Another is built on belief, which I think is another great title. And we'll talk about some of the other titles when we get to the other messages in this series. But those two alone are fabulous to just help you focus on that whole concept of fear and safety and helping you feel better about how you're doing and how the process is going for you. They help with trust. They help surrender in order to get you to the point where you can actually discern fantasy from reality. And we love these paraliminals. Again, I use them all the time. Our students use them. We think they make a huge difference, and we would encourage you to check that out. So, to briefly recap, today we've discussed the first of three voices of failure, the voice of fear. We've identified the fact that this voice says, I'm not safe enough, and it can be overcome by the practice of awareness, the practice of trust, and the practice of surrender. A couple of great tools to help you with that are audio meditation from Holosync and paraliminals from Learning Strategies. These are tools that our students have used successfully for many years, and we encourage their use for everyone in our course. And so I would strongly suggest that you consider those and think about them. If you've been hearing the voice of fear in your brain, if that is a loud and persistent voice saying, I am not safe enough when it comes to the bar exam, don't let that persist. Don't let it go on. It tends to get louder over time, not softer unless you do something about it. So I hope that you'll take the opportunity to become more aware, to separate fact from fiction, to trust and to know who to trust appropriately, and to surrender your fantasies to the realities of the world. When you do that, the reptilian brain relaxes, it comes out of its shell, it goes back to just collapsing and lying in the sun happily there, and things go much better, and your studies will get better. Now, as I said, in our second and third messages, we'll talk about the voice of cynicism and the voice of judgment. And I hope you'll stay with us for those two messages. Look forward to sharing them with you. Well, that's our look at the voice of fear. As I said, in upcoming episodes, we'll be looking at the two other voices of failure, the voice of cynicism and the voice of judgment. And if you found this helpful, I think you're going to want to stick around for those next two episodes. We'll be bringing them to you over the next couple of weeks. I hope everybody is doing well. Hope your studies are going well. Those of you getting ready for the February or July 2020 exams should be underway with your studies. And I do want to remind everyone that our free training webinar, Do Something Different, Make the Next Bar Exam Your Last Bar Exam, is available on demand. All you have to do is jump down in the show notes and click on the button, or go to celebrationbarreview.com/webinar to find out more about it. It's a great, great series and wonderful case studies, information I think you're really going to want to have. All right, everybody, have a great, warm, dry December week, and keep going with those studies. And we'll be back again next week along the Extra Mile.
Thanks for listening to the Extra Mile podcast for bar exam takers at www.celebrationbarreview.com.